How worried should we be about forever chemicals and microplastics? Let's find out together. Dr. Oliver Jones is a multi-award-winning chemist and internationally recognized expert in analytical and environmental science. A professor at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, he develops new ways to measure and monitor the chemicals that shape our world, from water safety to environmental health. Originally from Manchester, England, he earned his PhD from Imperial College London and has since held research and leadership roles at Cambridge, Durham, and RMIT. His work bridges chemistry, biology, and engineering to solve real-world problems in collaboration with industry and government partners. Dr. Jones is also a passionate science communicator and educator, recognized with multiple teaching awards and featured widely in major media outlets, including The Guardian, ABC News, The Washington Post, and now Succeed in Medicine. But first, a word from our sponsors. You're listening to Succeed in Medicine, the show for practicing physicians who want to master the parts of their career and life that med school never prepared us for. From interpersonal skills to career navigation to the essential information every physician needs. I'm Dr. Bradley Block, and in every episode, we bring you brass tacks advice and immediately applicable insights from world-class experts, so you can feel prepared wherever your MD takes you and build a life in medicine that's sustainable, rewarding, and actually worth all those years of sacrifice. You've spent years making careful decisions with lasting impact. When it comes to investing, the same principle applies. Lightstone Direct gives you access to institutional quality real estate investments with decades of proven experience behind them. Invest directly, no middlemen, and a $12 billion plus asset under management real estate firm in your corner. Remember, all investments involve risk. Please visit lightstonedirect.com for a full list of disclosures. Dr. Oliver Jones, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Oh, no problem, Brad. Thanks for having me.
First question, there is a lot in the news about microplastics and forever chemicals, and a lot of it seems really scary. Like there's already microplastics in our carotid endarterectomy specimens and found in people's brains, like we're all slowly turning to plastic. So with all that information out there, what have you done to change your consumption or exposure to these forever chemicals and microplastics?
Yeah, that's a great question. The simple answer is nothing, because I don't really think there's a problem that we need to worry about. I think a lot of it is just headlines. It's designed to get eyeballs and likes, clicks and whatnot, but doesn't represent the science.
I think that is very refreshing, right? Like the current status of rage baiting and headlines, that to hear from you that you haven't really changed your life in any material way, it's very reassuring. Okay, so then let's get really into the weeds as to why you would have that answer. So before we get started, let's just define some things. So what are microplastics? Because whenever there's an article about microplastics in the news, they show the tip of someone's finger with a little bit of shredded plastic on it. But I don't think that's what they're actually referring to. So what really are microplastics?
Funnily enough, there isn't actually a firm definition. There's common definitions, but there's one agreed upon. The most common one used is a piece of plastic that is 5 millimeters or less in diameter. And we're talking solid plastic particles there. But most of them are much, much smaller. We're talking 10 microns or smaller.
And so let's just tackle the microplastics. And so where are these being found?
There's the primary microplastics, which start out that small, and they're usually from cosmetics, so in facial scrubs and things like that. So you may have come across the microbead thing, but actually that's a really small, if anything, proportion of microplastics. Most of them come from the breakdown of larger pieces of plastic that people throw away, and they just gradually break down into smaller and smaller pieces. The problem is, although we see a lot of reports in the press about, oh, we found them in the brain and we found them in the lungs and we found them in testicles and things like that, it's actually really hard to measure microplastics. It's very tricky to actually measure a piece of plastic accurately. And there's a lot of background contamination. So you can test almost anything and you will find some plastic on it. The question is whether that's actually a problem or not. And the evidence from the World Health Organization and the US FDA is there's no evidence of health effects from microplastics.
Really? So then where did a lot of these more extreme claims come from?
That's a good question. I think a lot of it comes from social media. And we live in a really different media landscape than even 10 or 20 years ago. So now anyone can go on social media and say anything they like, and they don't have to have the qualifications to do it. No accountability. It's very easy to say, oh, this chemical is giving you cancer, or this is a real problem. And then you just walk away and people are like, well, what if it is happening? And it's much, much harder to sort of debunk that false information. I'm sure you see it in the medical field, a lot of people making health claims online, and there's absolutely no evidence for it. Look at what's happening in the US with vaccines, for example. All sorts of weird things are said, but it doesn't mean that they're true. And a lot of the time,
there's an axiom for that. I forgot who it's named after, but it's the BS asymmetry principle, which is it takes an order of magnitude more effort to debunk a piece of misinformation than the effort it was to create the piece of misinformation.
Exactly right. And once things are repeated often enough, they just take on. Say something often enough, people believe it's true. Yeah. Like we eat 5 grams of plastic a week. And very rarely do people think, well, hang on, does that actually make sense? So if we take the microplastics in brains study that came out recently, for example, they were reporting more microplastic in brains than we find in raw sewage. So it doesn't really make sense.
Yeah. Or there was a claim that if you use your plastic cutting board, you're consuming like 2 AA batteries worth of plastic, which would mean we'd all be burning through our cutting boards. But you buy a cutting board and you have a cutting board for a very long time without really coming close to consuming a significant amount of that cutting board. So most of these claims are being made for clicks. What you're saying is it really doesn't pose any risk yet that we can tell. And so that's not something that we do worry about. So in terms of drinking from plastic bottles and consuming food, using a microwavable container that's made of plastic instead of glass, these are things that we don't need to change in our lives.
No, I don't believe we do. And I think if they were such a big problem, why are we not seeing any sort of effects from allegedly, if you have all these microplastics, they give you all sorts of things, but we don't see that in public health records. And when manufacturers, for example, are made to change the composition of a material or take stuff out of a cosmetic, no one ever follows up to say, well, did that lead to an improved health outcome? It's never expected. No one ever does it. And we just move on. And the next big thing in environmental pollution comes along, and it really distracts from bigger problems like climate change, because we're all saying, oh, microplastics, PFAS, this, but well, not theoretically, but it's like a small thing that you can connect to people, whereas climate change, which is a big problem, is something that's more esoteric and harder to grasp.
Yes. And it seems so insurmountable, right? Like it's easier for me to buy glass containers to eat my food out of than it is for me to combat climate change. So because I can do it in my life, it suits me better. Yeah. But then if we're talking about climate change in the same breath as we are this microplastic, because how do we get plastic to begin with? It's from petroleum, right? It's all combined. But this becomes also a more complicated question, right? And actually, I've heard you talk about this before, where you say, well, actually, if you're shipping things in plastic, it takes a lot less gas to move it around the world than if you were putting it in glass, which is much heavier. And so now we can talk about things like this in terms of climate change, and then all the fear mongering around it. You can see how counterproductive it can be, because these need to be more nuanced discussions. But I think you make it pretty clear. Listen, there doesn't seem to be any problem with our health in this yet, from what we can tell.
Yeah, exactly right. It's a complex situation. In today's media landscape, people want a quick answer. Yes, no, it's bad, it's good. But that's not how toxicology works. It's not how medicine works. It's not how science works. It's nuanced, and you have to understand the context and the science behind it.
Okay, so because it seems like this is a pretty open and shut case with the microplastics, right? Don't change your life. You don't have to worry about. There are bigger fish to fry. Is there anything else that bears mentioning? Like, is there anything else that you've seen? Any other misinformation that you've seen about microplastics that you'd like to dispel before we move on?
I think the thing is, I'm not trying to say that plastics in the environment aren't a problem.
In our bodies, yes. Nobody's saying that plastic pollution is not a problem.
But the actual risks are much lower than people think. And you don't just have to take my word for it. The US FDA reviewed all the literature. The Health Organization reviewed all the literature, not just from microplastics in food and drink, but also in the air. And so despite the thousands of papers that are published, and there's more every year, because if you're a scientist, if you say, oh, I'm going to research microplastics, you can get grant funding. And obviously, if you want to get a grant, you can't say, well, it's probably fine, but give me some money just in case. You have to no, this is a big problem and I need to get a grant to fund it. But the evidence of health effects just isn't there. And plastics have been around since the 1940s and 50s. And there was a significant increase in use in the 90s. People often say something like, well, they thought smoking was good for you at first, or they thought asbestos, for example. But it's a false equivalence, because it's not like you can take anything in a food container, you have to actually test the safety first. It's just that all of that safety testing is done behind the scenes, and nobody wants to wade through 50 pages, 60 pages of DA's health and safety reports. And we have different procedures in place today than we did in the 1940s and 50s in terms of environmental regulation, for example, and how new products can be used on the market and how they have to be tested. So it's not, you're comparing apples with oranges when you say, okay, well, it's just the same as smoking, because it's just not.
Yeah, we see the same arguments on the other side from these physicians who think they're ahead of the ball. Yes, there is a problem here that it takes a long time for research to then become widespread knowledge that is adopted by physicians at large, right? I think there's like a 10-year period for practices to actually change. And this is something we've talked about on the podcast in the past. But at the same time, there are these physicians that feel like they're ahead of the curve and everyone thinks they're Galileo. But really, there are a lot of grifters out there that are just trying to make money off of things that aren't ready for prime time. So they're making a claim and saying they're ahead of the ball, ultimately in order to sell stuff and clickbait, which is where all this misinformation comes from anyway.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, because if you're trying to make money from social media, you get it from likes, right? Clicks and likes. And in order to get lots of clicks and likes, you need to get attention and you've got to stand out. And the way to stand out is to make some sort of emotive appeal about, hey, your health is going to be damaged, your children's health is going to be damaged, etc. But you don't get lots of clicks and likes by explaining the chemistry of polymers or even the details about how medicines work, right? You just say, no, do this, don't eat this.
And don't trust this person because I know better, right? I'm your savior. Okay, so speaking of polymers, what is a forever chemical? I would imagine you're not in the lab writing papers about forever chemicals, right? And so this word, what does it encompass?
Well, it doesn't encompass is polymers, because PFAS aren't polymers. So again, there's a few different definitions of what PFAS are. So the long one, the abbreviation stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which is basically where you've got a long carbon chain and it's got lots of fluorines coming off it. So really it's the chemistry of carbon and fluorine based molecules. And the term forever chemicals, I really hate that term because it's very misleading, right? They're not forever. They don't last forever. They don't even stay in the body forever, but they do break down very slowly. So lingering chemicals might be a better term.
Although actually that if you want to gross someone out, I think forever chemical is going to scare them a little bit, but lingering chemicals is going to gross them out.
Yeah, it may be. It's a good point. But I think forever chemicals actually came from an article in the Washington Post. It's a bit of a chemical play on words because PFAS are fluorine and carbon. So fluorine starts with an F, carbon starts with a C, forever starts with an F, chemical starts with a C. So it's a little chemical pun, but it's actually wrong in terms of the chemistry.
Okay.
Now, there are different definitions of PFAS. And so sometimes when you read the article, they'll say, oh, PFAS is 4,000 chemicals. And sometimes they'll say, oh, it's 7 million chemicals. And sometimes they'll say it's 14,000 chemicals, right? And the reason is there are different definitions. So the OECD has a very broad definition, which is anything that has a CF3 or a CF2 group in it is a PFAS.
Okay.
The US EPA has a slightly different definition. And the reason is if you use the OECD definition, then certain drugs like Prozac become PFAS because they have a CF3 group in them. But obviously Prozac are not as risky as some of the nastier PFAS chemicals.
Yeah.
They're completely different. And
right. And then if you use that broader definition, now you can start saying, oh, we found it here and we found it there. And look, all the places you have these forever chemicals and ultimately you're measuring the wrong thing.
Well, exactly. But the thing is, if you say like, if I use the OECD definition, there's about 7 million chemicals on PubChem that could be PFAS and probably a few thousand of them that are actually in common use. Right?
Yeah.
But if you have 2,000 chemicals, they're not all going to have the same properties. Now, some of them are potentially dangerous if at certain concentrations, just like certain pharmaceuticals are potentially dangerous. All pharmaceuticals are potentially dangerous if you take them at the wrong amount. Everything is a chemical. Every chemical has a risk attached to it. Some things are riskier than others, but it's about context. So even something very common like paracetamol or acetaminophen, right? You take a couple of tablets or any painkiller, you take a couple to cause your headache. If you overdose on them, it's going to cause liver problems.
Yeah.
Right? It's a question of dose. And it's the same with PFAS. Potentially, if you're in a manufacturing site and you're being exposed to huge amounts of them, maybe, but normal everyday person, you're not getting a high enough dose to have any sort of effect. And people miss that nuance. It's like, oh, it's just PFAS. It's not how much PFAS.
Yeah. And so where are we finding those?
Well, actually, there's a good question because there's a bit of argument about the precedent.
Right. If we haven't even come to an agreement on how to define them, where do we find them is a tricky question.
Well, it depends. So if you think of the film Dark Waters, for example, that was based around a manufacturing plant that was making certain types of PFAS. But the people working in that factory, that's a bit of a different situation. A lot of perfluorinated chemicals were used in what's called film forming foams, which are foams that you use to fight fires, particularly those from fuel, like aviation fuel, for example. That's where military bases, airports, and firefighting training centers where they practice putting out fires that are based on high-octane fuels. They often have high concentrations of PFAS in the surrounding groundwater and soil because they've been spraying the foam. And sometimes if you live close to one of those sites and you're using groundwater as your drinking water source, you might have higher in your drinking water. Because there's such a wide variety of chemicals, you can find PFAS in makeup, you can find PFAS in some food containers because it's that anti-grease. PFAS are really good because they repel both water and grease. So you can make them on food products to keep the grease off your container. You find them in some of the water clothing, for example, like Gore-Tex, I think used to have a lot of PFAS in it, whether it still does, I'm not sure, because some manufacturers have changed the formula for their materials just because of public concern.
A great example of that, I think this story from Starbucks, right? They originally made the pumpkin spice latte not to be pumpkin flavored, but to use the same flavors that are used in pumpkin pie, like the flavors of the season, like nutmeg and cloves, but it never had any pumpkin. And then there was this big public outcry because it's not made with real pumpkin. And then they started using some real pumpkin and it tasted gross. And this is where we ruin it for ourselves, right? It's totally safe. It's used in safe amounts. It's been vetted already. But then there's a big public cry, right? Like the same substance that's been used in foam in yoga mats is being used in Subway's sandwich bread. And now they've got to change their formula, not because of a safety issue, but because of this silly public outcry that is based in fear so that someone else can get clicks, not so we can actually get safe food.
Yeah, exactly. You see it in a lot of industries, like the cosmetic industry, for example, constantly to change the formulation of cosmetics because people don't like the parabens, which are a sort of small preservative molecules to keep your makeup from going off. And they cause problems. So then you've got to reformulate it. And you potentially might replace a well-studied chemical with one that is not as well-studied and might potentially be worse, but just because you can then say, well, I don't have chemical X in it anymore.
If you like this podcast episode, you're going to love the other shows over at the Doctor Podcast Network. For instance, luxury cruising. You know that moment? Sipping champagne, watching the sunset from your private balcony suite? Yeah, that's the magic of luxury cruising. Dr. Crystal Seditis takes you there on Luxury Cruising, Explore the World in Style. From the most opulent ships to insider secrets on upgrades, she's your guide to traveling first class at sea. If you're dreaming of your next escape, this is the podcast for you. Search Luxury Cruising and subscribe. Your suite awaits. We need to have a line of products and foods for people who believe in science. We're like, no, we're just going to use the same stuff that's been studied, that's been working really well, and we're not going to respond to fear. They've got these honest products that are basically built on fear, right? We're going to be honest about what's in it. We're going to have simple ingredients. Can we also have the science-based product lines that appeal to the people that are really going to be cheaper and it's not going to go bad and it's going to be just fine for you and it's going to be fine for the environment and we can just have our products and keep them?
Yeah. I mean, there are some PFAS that are potentially dangerous in certain concentrations. But most people, if you read the drinking water quality guidelines, they'll say, oh yeah, this drinking water is above the US EPA guideline for PFAS. The drinking water guideline is basically, until recently, I think the EPA changed it, but it was so low, it basically, if you detect a single molecule of PFAS, you're going to fail the guideline. And then what are you going to do? But then if you decide, okay, well, we're going to treat all our water to get below the US EPA guidelines, the cost of that is absolutely huge. If you get your drinking water from a city where they've got a large drinking water plant, and then they've got economies of scale, so it'll still cost, but they might not cost you quite as much. That's one thing. But if you live in a remote area or a small town where you've got a small plant, the cost to get, say, 4 nanograms per liter down to 1 nanogram per liter or lower is millions of dollars. And it's going to be put on the people that probably can't afford it the most. Right? So all the people making fuss about it and causing the fear aren't the ones that have to fund the changes.
Yeah.
And again, no one's going to come back and say, hey, we reduced PFAS to less. Did that improve public health? No one will check.
Okay, so what are the health risks then that people are talking about? I'm reluctant to even ask this question because I don't want to put it out there in the universe even more, but let's start with the reasonable stuff. Like in higher doses, what are the concerns that PFAS are going to cause in humans?
A better question might be, what concerns have not been raised about PFAS?
What is proven to be a risk of elevated concentrations of PFAS in the body?
The allegations were that 3M, that was one of the manufacturers, knew that very high concentrations in rats cause developmental issues and there was some reproductive issues. And there's been some allegations that potentially effects on the immune system, particularly in young children. But actually proven effects of everyday exposure, actually none. Because all of the papers, when you look, if you're a scientist and you want to publish a paper on PFAS, and not every scientist, but you want to get it published, you need to find something. You can't find a journal that, if you find nothing, they're not going to publish it. So they will often use much higher concentrations of PFAS in the study than you actually find in the environment. And it would be the same as studying the safety of a drug and just giving like a whole tub's worth of drugs to the patient and go, see, it's bad, because it doesn't reflect what actually happens in the environment. It's that effect concentration versus the exposure concentration.
So the immune system and reproductive abilities.
So
when you hear about these hormone disrupting chemicals, right? Is that what they're referring to PFAS?
Well, that's one of the things that they have alleged that PFAS might be endocrine disruptors. I think primarily they're thinking things like BPA and the contraceptive pill that once people have taken and it goes through the sewage treatment works and so forth. But again, talking about medicine, the endocrine system is quite complex. So often people will say, oh, it's an endocrine disruptor. And if you say, well, what do you mean by that? They can't answer, because theoretically, homeostasis in the body is controlled by hormones. So almost anything that you take could hypothetically, coffee relates to change in your metabolism. Your metabolism then reacts to go back to normal, or if you're tired or something. So you can argue a lot of different things are endocrine disruptors in some way or another, but does it actually matter? Now, most people, when they say endocrine disrupting, they're really thinking of an estrogenic effect. So promoting sort of female characteristics in males.
Yeah.
And so having an effect like some of the female hormones, or an androgenic effect, so stopping the effect of testosterone. But again, it goes to how do you define an endocrine disruptor? And most of the time, it's does the chemical interact even slightly with the estrogen receptor in the body? But the binding capacity of most of these things that they say are endocrine is thousands or tens of thousands less than normal human hormones.
Yeah.
So they really aren't going to induce a biological change. So if you think of an endocrine, it's got to come, it's going to bind to the receptor. That receptor then has to do something in the cell. Then you have to have a biological response to it.
Yeah.
You're just not going to get that with a lot of these things that binds in a teeny tiny interaction. It's just not going to do anything biologically.
So you're telling me you still touch receipts? Because that's another one that I heard. I don't touch receipts because it's going to mess up my hormones.
Yeah, exactly. So they're thinking of BPA there because BPA is used in the thermal receipt paper. But you've got to think again, you see in bottles and receipts, you'll see a lot of stuff saying, oh, it's now BPA free. Well, that's great. But what are you using instead of
What they replace
BPA?
it with? Yeah.
And in fact, there's a whole family of bisphenols, almost the whole alphabet. And one of the most common replacements is BPS, but you can also get BPF and BPE. And a lot of those are much less studied and potentially might be worse. But you can say it's BPA free, even if you're using something that's almost the same, but it's not BPA. So in a sense, it's a bit of greenwashing. People say, I want BPA free bottles. So, well, here's a BPA free bottle or a BPA receipt, but it's pretty much the same thing.
Yeah. Just substituting one acronym for another.
BPA is probably one of the most studied compounds in the world. If you look at the list, there's thousands of papers on BPA. And again, no one has shown it actually has any kind of effect at relevant concentrations. And it binds to the estrogen receptor. I think it's like 1,000 times less than standard estrogens would do.
Can you think of a situation where the chemophobia was warranted? Where there was actually, you're in Australia, so ozone layer notwithstanding. Thankfully, that appears to be behind us. Ozone layer notwithstanding, where the chemophobia was actually warranted and it needed to change how we manufacture food or clothes or distribute it or how we behave.
Well, not recently. I mean, you could think the thalidomide disaster, which I know didn't really happen in the US because your regulators refused to approve it at the time. But it was obviously thought to be safe, given to pregnant women, and then discovered that it wasn't, and then it had to be changed pretty quick. People were concerned about smoking, and that took a long time before people gathered enough evidence to show that, hey, we do need to restrict smoking. But again, it all comes back to context. There's plenty of things that we come across every day in our lives that are potentially bad for us, like alcohol. People often say PFAS is a carcinogen. Alcohol is a class 1 carcinogen. We know it causes cancer.
Excellent point. Where we don't have enough chemophobia around it. People are trying to rationalize their drinking. Well, it's only on these, and I'm cutting back. My alcohol intake is cut back quite a significant amount. after, just from my life and just where I am. But also, since reading about it, I think twice before I'll have a drink, and I drink considerably less than I used to. So that's an excellent point, where we don't have the chemophobia, but maybe we should, because we know that even a little alcohol increases your risk of cancer.
But we also know that you can have like a glass of wine and you're not going to get cancer straight away.
It's not radioactive wine, right?
But the way we talk about PFAS is like, oh, no, PFAS, you're going to get cancer and die. But alcohol, which we know is bad, people are more nuanced about. And it's the same with sun exposure, right? You know that UV light from the sun causes skin cancer. And that's why we use sunscreen and we cover up. But we also know that we don't get skin cancer as soon as we step outside the door in summer. And there's a difference between sitting on the beach in summer for 2 hours and going out in wintertime. The exposure is different. And people in general aren't so good at weighing up risk, because we worry about things a lot. There's a lot of worry about microplastics and not an awful lot about alcohol, despite the fact that alcohol is proven much, much bigger effects.
That's a good point, that when we're rationalizing it, we're able to think about and consider the nuance of small doses and minimizing risk, whereas we're not doing it with these other things that I guess we're just not as familiar with. Alcohol, we're pretty familiar with it and its effects and where to find it and how to avoid it. But I think the summary here is really the way that you started the episode. Don't worry about this stuff. We've got bigger fish to fry. If it's out there, it's because it's been studied, it's been vetted, and what we may end up replacing it with could potentially be worse than the thing that we're causing fear around. And so take a beat, worry about the things that you really need to worry about, and keep on eating and living a more sustainable life.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, it's good to be cautious. It's good to be careful, but we have, particularly in the West, we've got regulators, we've got the EPA, we've got the FDA, we've got all these people doing safety checks. It's not the case that you can put whatever you like on the market and just wait and see what happens, right?
Yeah.
You have to have approval, have to be safety testing. Now, there are parts of the world where that's not the case. People can put whatever they like on the market, and that's a riskier proposition. But in the US, Australia, Canada, the UK, we've got, at the moment at least, very good regulation and safety assessment.
For the moment. All right, fantastic. Well, Dr. Ollie Jones, if people want to learn more about you, they want to find you online, where do they find you?
Well, they just Google my name. I'm on all the social media platforms as Dr._Ollie_Jones. If you Google Oliver Jones RMIT University, you'll find my university webpage. I'm on LinkedIn. Shouldn't have too much trouble tracking me down.
Excellent. Well, I'm not going to worry about microplastics anymore. I'm not going to worry about PFAS, and I'm not going to worry about BPA, but I'm sure I'm going to find something else to worry about next. Thank you so much for your time and all you do to keep the world safe.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. I have a favor to ask. You listened to the episode until the end, which means either you fell asleep or you really liked the episode. So please write us a 5-star review, take a screenshot, and email it to me so I can send you a quick guide on how to earn patient trust in 20 seconds or less. Email me at brad@physiciansguidetodoctoring.com and feel free to suggest a topic or guest. I take your requests seriously. The views expressed on this episode are those of the interviewer and the interviewee and do not represent the views of their employer or even their significant other. Even though the magic of podcasting makes it sound like I'm talking directly to you, this is not a doctor-patient relationship, and this is not medical advice, or financial advice, or legal advice, or really any advice. Thanks again for listening to Succeed in Medicine.